Good afternoon, and today we're going to keep talking about Odell. This is on Odell number 3, and the impossibility of retreats. So, as promised in last week's Zoom class, we're going to discuss the phenomenon of digital retreats and connect it to communes, communal living situations that were particularly popular in the 1960s, connected back to Epicurus and the Epicurean garden school, and use all of these different things to reflect on the concept of how to do nothing. Okay, so let's begin. First of all, Odell begins by noting that when you are constantly wired into this online world, it's quite common for many people, particularly with phone addiction and obsessing over social media posts, to feel very much like it's necessary to escape modern life. That is to say, to leave technology and the confines of the digital enclosure behind, right? And go back to nature, enjoy one's life in different ways. She notes that when she does turn her phone off and just simply stops using it for several days at a time, it almost creates a kind of a psychedelic effect where the phone becomes this a dead inert object like a stone, right, or a piece of wood, instead of this portal into this very complex and anxiety inducing world, right? And so Odell notes in herself that she starts to romanticize this concept of giving it all up, right, and leaving it all behind, going into the wilderness to commune with nature and getting rid of all the stuff of modern life and the need for more, right? And consumption and greed and all these sorts of things. And, the anxiety that maybe we can all relate to now around the news cycle, for example. So she begins by giving us an interesting object lesson. Excuse me, it's just a little espresso. Delicious. Uh, of this young man named Levi Felix, right? Who was hospitalized for burnout, for essentially a kind of emotional and mental breakdown, right? And so to him, he felt as though it had to do with his technology addiction, right? He was a programmer, a high level programmer at Google, and he was furthermore had completely embraced technology and was obsessively using his phone, and so he blamed this in part for his emotional collapse. So he and his girlfriend traveled to Cambodia, where he studied mindfulness with some Buddhist monks, right? And when he returned, he had a kind of a revelation, right? In which he was going to create a camp for digital detox, for digitally addicted, festering with anxiety people like himself. He was going to bring them out into the wilderness and heal their addled minds, right? With his, really, his gentle sort of camp activities, right? This was the idea. So, superfood making, right? You get a blender and you stuff kale in it and some blueberries and a banana and an avocado, right? And some other things and blend it all up together and, try this. This is my superfood, right? Sounds very pleasant, actually. Cuddle therapy, right? Which is a popular way of soothing anxiety by just hugging someone, right? Again, in these times of social distancing, what's not to like, right? Pickling, that's something I like to do, right? Learning how to walk on stilts, you know, laughter yoga. So trying to do yoga poses that make you look silly, so you kind of induce laughter at yourself and other people, right? Having brunch, wearing your pajamas, singing, and running around in clown suits, right? The idea here was to use humor, the healing power of humor, and interactivity, and these sort of pleasant, everyday activities in order to release the kinds of bonds that technology had placed upon individuals, right? And everyone loved it. It was very popular, right? And soon, some of the leading technology companies like Microsoft and Apple Computing were sending their employees there on a corporate retreats, right? And paying for the privilege. And you know, this in turn led to this whole thing where the digital detox camp became co-opted. That is, it became captured by corporate interests who used it to uh, create more productive workers. Right. That is to reduce incidents of burnout by cuddle therapy, right? So that they could go back to work and be more productive workers. So keep this in mind about what Odell is trying to say about this, right? She also brings up a Burning Man festival, right, out there in Black Rock in the desert in Nevada, uh, canceled this summer because of the coronavirus. I noticed. And she describes how it became an attraction for the digital elite, right? So it started out as a real experimental art project, right? And lots of psychedelic drugs, etc., out there in the desert, right? But gradually it became more and more popular as it was seen as this opportunity to post on social media, your cool costume and all the other colorful and interesting events that were taking place during the week-long festival in the desert. And pretty soon, before you knew it, people were flying in on helicopters, right? Uh, you know, Mark Zuckerberg was there, and the digital elite started to kind of take it over. And once again, it became kind of popular as a corresponding train track to productivity, right? So you've got these kind of far out, weird digital detoxes and these Burning Man festivals. And they really were ultimately kind of running alongside mainstream capitalistic productivity, right? So again, let's keep that in mind in terms of what Odell is trying to say with this, right? So she goes on to discuss the Garden School, which in 4th century BC, right, a philosopher whose name was Epicurus, and he was kind of grumpy, right? Wasn't particularly, he was kind-hearted, right, but not sort of publicly nice, right? So he said, stupid fools are those who are never satisfied with what they possess, but only lament what they cannot have, right? And here he is talking about a fundamental precept of capitalism, which is restless desire, right? Adam Smith and others talk about the kind of restless need that a particularly consumer-based capitalism produces in its consumers, in citizens, right? And that uh, desires lusting after different objects, ambitions, right? Ego, that is, bolstering your ego by obtaining objects or things that sort of serve to show off your importance and wealth, and fear, right? Fear that it'll be taken all away. Since you derive so much meaning from material objects, what happens to you when they're gone, right? You become nothing. You are a total loser, right? And so that has to be staved off as much as possible. And Epicurus noted, right, that humans actually need very little in the way of material objects in order to be happy and in order to find meaning. Happiness and meaning, right, which are two separate things, connected but different concepts, right? Neither of them really flow from material wealth, right? A certain amount of stability and security is required both to feel happy, to be unconstrained by anxiety, and also to find meaning because meaning involves a search, right? But again, Epicurus noted none of these were in fact material things. So what he sought to do inside the school was to, in part, to strip away these kinds of myths and superstitions that he found people carried around. So even back in the 4th century BC, people were concerned with all these kinds of conspiracy theories that, coronavirus is made in a lab to take out all the old people and the boomers or whatever, or whatever the conspiracy theory might be. So people at that time were also walking around with a lot of wrong-headed ideas that were creating all kinds of anxieties and fears inside of them, right? And it was very difficult for them to dispel. So the first job of the garden school was to subtract things, as we've been saying all along about this book. One of the main concepts here is that sometimes less is more, right? You need to take things away in order to open up space to see things in a different light, right? And so Epicurus saw it as his job in those days to make people stop worrying about the gods, right? The Olympian gods, they were always concerned, the gods are gonna be angry, they're gonna punish me if I do it this way or that way, right? He said, no, forget about that. You can't control that. I mean, he wasn't a believer, but he didn't try to say you're wrong, that they don't exist or whatever. He just said, look, you can't control it. Let's try to move past that whole concept, right? The next thing he did was to create in his school a non-competitive environment. He wasn't going to eliminate competition altogether. It's impossible and maybe not even really desirable, right? But that overall the structure of the school was designed to be non-competitive. So no R score here, right? The idea instead was to foster people helping each other to grasp the material, right? Together, to kind of get this sense of a shared project, right? That we're all in it together and that we need to help each other in order to move along, right? And to do that, he found that it was necessary to form friendships, that in fact friendships between people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different, race wasn't really a concept back then, but different cultures and different genders, for example, was necessary in order for this sense of kind of a shared project to coexist. So to do that, he actually started teaching courses on friendship, what it meant to be a friend, how friendships were formed, how they persevered and endured over time, how they changed depending on conditions. And he found that in the study of friendship, people began to make friends. So that's cool. And we'll come back in a second for round 2.